Today, July 1st, Israel is set to annex 1/3 of the occupied West Bank. This would, of course, be a violation of international law, but no one is going to do anything about it since the U.S. supports Israel so vociferously. The West Bank currently looks like Swiss cheese. People call it that a lot. It has very specific districting borders, and it separates different pieces of land for different purposes. The West Bank has at least 140 checkpoints that severely limit travel for Palestinians. And there are 1.5 million Palestinian refugees in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, as well as bordering countries including Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. So I'm just putting, some truths out there to kind of contextualize the fact that Israel is set to annex the West Bank. Israel's intention in terms of annexation is to annex the Jordan Valley, which is the furthest east part of the West Bank. So if you don't know what Israel looks like, most of Israel, so Israel's like along the Mediterranean. In the southwest corner of it is the Gaza Strip, which is where a lot of Palestinians are basically packed in. It's a very narrow strip with a lot of people. There's also the West Bank, which is actually on the eastern part of Israel. It is Palestine, but it's east of Israel. And it's called the West Bank because it's the West Bank of the Jordan River. So why does Israel want to annex the Jordan Valley? The Jordan Valley is where half of the West Bank's agriculture is. This means that by annexing the Jordan Valley, it has several effects. It deprives Palestinians of agriculture and access to water, or rather, it makes Palestinians even more dependent on Israel for those things. It also encloses the West Bank entirely on all sides with claimed Israeli territory. So this is pretty bad. I mean, if you want a historical precedent of what this probably most resembles is, well, of course they're making it an apartheid state, but also it's really similar to the way that the United States colonized North America. What Israel is functionally doing is making things like Indian reservations for Palestinians. Like that is basically what they are now. They're states within a state, but they don't really have power. They're subsumed and dominated by the other state. That is kind of how I look at it. I'm losing it. I also have a really interesting story here from jewishcurrents.org. I'll credit them because I'm going to read a decent chunk of this article, and it's really interesting. That's how I'd put it. So jewishcurrents.org. They published a leaked memo from the American NGO, the Anti-Defamation League. And this document shows very heavy-handedly the type of propaganda that Israel defenders have in store for this. And before I get into what the article actually says, I just want to say that it's a shame that an organization like the Anti-Defamation League is working as an ideological apparatus as the Israeli state, because we really do need groups that will advocate for Jewish people. Anti-Semitism is, obviously, definitely seems heavily on the rise in the U.S. to me. and we need groups to defend against that. And it's not really fair that those same groups would be running cover for the Israeli government. But let's see what this article has to say. From Jewish Currents, quote, a leaked ADL strategy memo obtained by Jewish Currents sheds light on how the nominal civil rights organization is preparing to address annexation's critics. The, quote, stakeholders analysis memo warns that the group will need to find a way to defend Israel from criticism without alienating other civil rights organizations, elected officials of color, and Black Lives Matter activists and supporters. This memo suggests that the group hopes to avoid appearing openly hostile to public criticism of annexation while it works to block legislation that harshly censures Israel or leads to material consequences such as conditioning United States military support. In other words, what the ADL plans on doing is publicly, to people who know that this type of annexation is wrong, they want to be like, yeah, we understand. It is pretty messed up, isn't it, right? We'll just let you beat on us and tell us how bad we are. And then meanwhile, they're working in Congress to stop any reaction by the U.S. government, say to stop giving Israel military equipment. So they'll be publicly acting like they're bothered by annexation or have at least reservations about it, kind of ambivalent about it, but they will be continuing to enable it in Congress. So reading from the article again, the memo lists, quote, 8 top political and community engagement implications, end quote, that annexation could have. Among them, quote, complicate ADL's relationship with the Congressional Black Caucus, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, and the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, and the Progressive Caucus, end quote. They also said, quote, that it would pit ADL on the wrong side of the Black Lives Matter movement, end quote. And then another quote is, be used to label Israel as an occupier, racist, and apartheid state, end quote. Challenge relationships between ADL and many civil rights organizations and coalitions. So here what they're saying is basically that they know that annexation will rightfully cause people to call Israel an occupying country and a racist apartheid state. They know that. And they're worried that if they defend Israel too hard, they will begin looking like a conservative organization. So their plan is to, like I said, be this kind of punching bag for Netanyahu and the Israeli government, for progressive Americans who can be like, Israel sucks, this is screwed up, annexation, boo, all that stuff. ADL just soaks it up and continues doing exactly what they would otherwise do.
Just do it!
Jewish Currents continues, of particular concern to the ADL, according to the memo, is that the group will have to find a way to credibly defend Israel from accusations that it has formalized a system of discrimination and subjugation on the basis of ethno-national identity. Quote, the reference to apartheid or separate but equal systems to describe Israel will be a major political flashpoint. As an organization, how ADL responds to these attacks will be critical. The memo proposes as next steps that the ADL's communications teams and executive office, quote, game out how to respond to accusations of Israel being racist in an apartheid system, and when to respond in public and when to respond in private, end quote. I mean, this is as clear of an admission as you can get. They understand that Israel is an apartheid state. They know exactly what people are already saying about this. Separate but equal. It's just racist. And they know it. So what they are trying to be is, in public, we should be like, oh yeah, we totally get it. And then defend it in private. I mean, I can't quite emphasize how much that's true. Enough. Well, that's kind of what I keep saying.
I actually overheard someone saying that I thought was an interesting point.
So later on in the article, they write, quote, in a sign of the growing significance of the ongoing nationwide black-led uprising, the memo repeatedly stresses that similarities between Israel's techniques of occupation and institutionalized racism in the U.S. will lead to intensified criticism of Israel. Quote, at this moment in our country, when we are collectively going through a moment of racial reckoning, Israel will be painted as akin to an ethno-nationalist country which continues to oppress and subject Palestinians. And the memo continues, quote, if violence erupts, the Middle East will be looked at from the prison of the George Floyd domestic movement, end quote.
You've memorized a bunch of talking points.
And the article continues just to sum all of this up. This puts it really succinctly. The memo makes clear that the ADL does not want to be seen publicly as defending annexation, even as it hopes to mollify annexation's critics. Quote, ADL must provide a space for local and national leaders to express their criticism of Israel's decisions. Do not give the impression that ADL is an ally of PM Netanyahu and a supporter of annexation.
It's totally made up. We made up this one.
So this is the just sick part to me. They know enough about what is actually happening that they know what to say and when, who to say it to, and to continue Israel's domination of Palestine, while simultaneously, playing the good liberal in America, like, oh shucks guys, this is so sad, we totally are with you guys, this is so sad. Netanyahu's just like Trump, isn't he?
Mike Lindell of My Pillow. Boy, do you sell those pillows? That's unbelievable what you do.
There's also a part in the article that I didn't read, but they basically acknowledged how much they look like absolute shit when the leader, president, or whatever he is of the ADL kept smearing Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib is like anti-Semitic and really just railing against them. He's like, the memo's like, yeah, we look pretty racist when we single out black and or Arab women about this. That's racist! So that's terrible news. I'll try to keep up with this story. To be honest, I don't talk about Israel and Palestine a whole lot on this podcast, mostly because it's a terrible issue, and it, like, every time I read about it, it feels like, wow, this is just getting worse and worse. It's more of the same, but worse and worse, and I don't exactly know how to report on that, so I'll try to follow Israel a little bit